You probably walked past this completely ordinary-looking plant today, stepped right over it on your way to the driveway, or nudged it aside with your boot heel in the backyard, completely unaware that the Amish elders of Lancaster County have protected it, nurtured it, and quietly harvested it for generations as one of the most powerful natural antibiotics this continent has ever produced. This is not a story about exotic herbs flown in from remote jungles. This is not something you need to order from an expensive online retailer or find behind the counter at a specialty health shop. This is something growing right now, almost certainly within walking distance of wherever you are sitting. And the people who built their communities without electricity, without hospitals, and without pharmaceutical supply chains knew exactly what it was capable of. The Amish do not pull this plant from the ground. They do not spray it. They do not curse it as a nuisance the way most modern homeowners do. And once you understand what they know, once you see what generations of quiet, disciplined, deeply practical people preserved through hard experience and careful memory, you will never look at this so-called weed the same way again. Meanwhile, the modern world has spent decades conditioning us to reach for a small orange prescription bottle the moment our bodies show the first sign of struggle. Big Pharma built a trillion-dollar empire on the simple idea that nature's original solutions needed to be replaced, patented, and sold back to us at enormous cost. They funded research that buried older knowledge. They shaped the medical curriculum that trained the doctors we were taught to trust above all else. And somewhere in that long, profitable process, the wisdom of people like the Amish, people who never stopped using what the earth provided, got quietly pushed to the margins of history. But it never disappeared. It was passed from grandmother to granddaughter in quiet Pennsylvania kitchens. It was written in the margins of old herbalist journals that still survive in private collections. And it continued growing, season after season, in the cracks of sidewalks, along fence lines, at the edges of gardens, waiting patiently for someone to remember what it was for. Now, before we go any further, I want to be transparent with you about something important. Because this channel is about education and about honoring historical knowledge, not about replacing the guidance of qualified medical professionals. Everything you are about to hear reflects the fascinating historical and traditional uses documented across centuries of folk medicine and ancestral practice. If you are dealing with a serious health condition, if you are taking prescription medications, or if you are pregnant or nursing, please consult a qualified healthcare provider before adding anything new to your routine or consuming any plant from the wild. That said, what we are about to explore together is a genuine piece of living history that deserves to be understood, respected, and remembered. Now let me tell you exactly what this plant is, exactly what the elders knew about it, and exactly how they prepared it. Because by the end of this video, you will have the complete picture that the history books quietly left out. Here's the part that most people who stumble onto this topic never actually receive. Because they find a short article, they read a surface-level summary, and they walk away with the name, but not the knowledge. What I am going to give you today is the full story. The origin, the identification, the science that modern researchers have finally started to catch up on. The multiple ways the Amish and other ancestral communities actually use this plant in real, documented practice. And most importantly, I am going to walk you through the exact preparation method, the precise proportions, and the traditional process that the elders used, the one that industrial agriculture and the pharmaceutical lobby have spent considerable energy ensuring never made it into your standard health education. Stay with me through this entire video because the preparation detail I save for the end is the piece that changes everything. And it is the piece that most people who have heard of this plant have never actually been given. And if this kind of recovered ancestral knowledge matters to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because we post new videos every single week uncovering the forgotten wisdom that built resilient, self-sufficient communities long before any of us were born. Let's dig in to understand why the Amish protect this plant with such quiet, almost reverent consistency. You have to go back much further than the Amish communities of Pennsylvania. You have to go back to a time when the people crossing the Atlantic in wooden ships, carrying almost nothing with them, needed to know which plants growing in the New World could keep their families alive. The earliest European settlers, many of them arriving with knowledge passed down from medieval monastic healers and village herbalists, encountered a plant that indigenous peoples of North America had already been using for centuries before contact. The Cherokee used it, the Iroquois documented its properties in their healing traditions, And when the German-speaking Anabaptist communities, the ancestors of the Amish, began settling in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s, they brought with them a healing tradition that was already deeply familiar with this plant's European relatives and recognized its American cousin almost immediately. What happened next was a quiet convergence of two completely separate streams of ancestral knowledge, one rooted in the forests of Central Europe, the other in the woodlands and riverbanks of the Eastern American continent, both pointing toward the same conclusion. This plant, this ordinary, overlooked, routinely discarded plant, had properties that no early community with limited access to physicians could afford to ignore. There are documented accounts from the 1800s, preserved in old Mennonite and Amish community records and in the journals of traveling physicians who visited these settlements, describing the use of this plant during outbreaks of infection, during wound care after farming accidents, and during the brutal winter illnesses that regularly threatened entire households before modern sanitation existed. One particular account from an Ohio Amish community in the mid-1800s describes an elder woman who was called to homes throughout her district. Whenever a wound had begun to show the dark, swollen signs of what we would now recognize as bacterial infection, she would arrive with dried leaves and a small clay pot, and in almost every recorded case, the progression of the infection stopped. Her preparation was not mysterious to her community. It was simply knowledge, passed carefully, practiced consistently, and protected because they understood that in a world without pharmacies, the difference between knowing and not knowing could be the difference between life and death. That knowledge survived because the Amish do not abandon what works simply because something newer appears. And now let us talk about the plant itself, because if you have seen it and not known what it was, this description is going to stay with you for the rest of your life. Plantain, and I am not talking about the large tropical fruit you find in the grocery store. I am talking about Plantago Major. The broadleaf plantain is one of the most common and most universally ignored plants in the entire temperate world. It grows low and flat to the ground, forming a rosette of oval, two egg-shaped leaves that can range from about 2 inches long in a young plant to nearly 7 or 8 inches in a mature specimen that has had a full growing season to establish itself. The leaves are a deep, matte green, not the shiny, reflective green of something like a lily or a magnolia leaf, but a soft, almost dusty green that catches light differently depending on the angle, giving it a slightly silvery appearance in the early morning when dew sits on its surface. If you look closely at any single leaf, you will notice something that experienced foragers and herbalists call the rib test, a feature so distinctive that once you see it, identification becomes nearly effortless. Running from the base of the leaf to its tip are between 3 and 5 parallel veins that stand out prominently from the surface, like thin cables embedded just below the skin of the leaf. If you gently tear a leaf crosswise and pull the two halves slowly apart, those veins will stretch out like thin green strings, almost like the threads in a piece of canvas fabric, refusing to break cleanly. That stringy vein behavior is your absolute confirmation. The plant's texture is slightly waxy on the upper surface and just faintly fuzzy on the underside, especially in younger leaves, and when you crush a fresh leaf between your fingers, you will notice a faint green, slightly grassy, almost cucumber-like smell that is subtle but unmistakable once you have experienced it. It produces a slender, unremarkable spike rising straight up from the center of the rosette, sometimes reaching 6 to 10 inches tall, covered in tiny pale flowers that become small oval seed capsules as the season progresses. You will find it growing in compacted soil along the edges of driveways, between cracks in sidewalks, at the base of fence posts, in lawns that have seen heavy foot traffic, in garden beds that have been disturbed, and along the shoulders of gravel paths. It thrives precisely where other plants struggle, which is part of why it has survived alongside human civilization on every continent for thousands of years. The most remarkable moment in the modern scientific story of this plant came not from a university laboratory funded by a pharmaceutical grant, but from a series of independent researchers in Eastern Europe during the 1980s who were studying folk medicine traditions. With a rigor that Western science had largely refused to apply to ancestral healing knowledge, what they found, when they began systematically analyzing the chemical composition of Plantago Major, was not the vague, unquantifiable healing energy that critics of herbal medicine love to dismiss. What they found was a precise, measurable, and genuinely impressive arsenal of biologically active compounds that explained, with cold scientific clarity, exactly why generations of Amish elders, Cherokee healers, and medieval European herbalists had all independently arrived at the same conclusion about this plant. The first compound that demands your attention is Aucubin, an Iridoid Glycoside that sits at the heart of this plant's antimicrobial power. Aucubin works through a mechanism that is fundamentally different from how synthetic antibiotics operate, and that difference is critically important. Most pharmaceutical antibiotics work by targeting a specific biological process in a specific category of bacteria, which is precisely why bacterial resistance develops so efficiently against them. Aucubin, by contrast, appears to disrupt bacterial function through a broader, less specific pathway that makes the development of resistance significantly more difficult for microorganisms to achieve. Multiple peer-reviewed studies, including research published in journals of natural product chemistry and ethnopharmacology, have confirmed measurable inhibitory activity from Aucubin against several strains of bacteria, including some that have become increasingly resistant to conventional antibiotic treatment. But Aucubin does not work alone. Sitting alongside it in the chemical profile of this leaf is bacolin and its glycoside form, as well as a compound called Acteoside, sometimes referred to in the literature as Verbascoside, which has demonstrated both antimicrobial and powerful anti-inflammatory properties in controlled laboratory settings. The inflammation piece matters enormously, because the reason a bacterial infection becomes dangerous so quickly is not always the bacteria itself, but the inflammatory cascade your immune system triggers in response to it. A compound that can address both the pathogen and the inflammatory response simultaneously is, from a pharmacological perspective, genuinely remarkable. Then there is the mucilage content of the fresh leaf, a gel-like polysaccharide complex that coats and soothes irritated tissue, which explains the plant's long-documented use in wound care and respiratory complaints. And layered beneath all of this is a significant concentration of a compound so well regarded in modern dermatology for its ability to stimulate cell regeneration and accelerate tissue repair that it is now deliberately synthesized and added to expensive commercial wound care and skincare products. The Amish did not need a synthesis lab. They just never stopped using the leaf that had always contained it. Now, understanding what these compounds are is only half of the picture, because the true depth of this plant's relevance to daily life becomes clear only when you see the full range of ways that ancestral communities and increasingly modern researchers have documented its effects across multiple systems of the human body. The most well-known application, the one that keeps appearing in every folk medicine tradition, from Appalachia to the German countryside to the rural communities of Eastern Europe, is the plant's extraordinary behavior when applied directly to infected or inflamed skin. An Amish mother who found her child with a deep splinter wound that had already begun to redden and swell around the edges would not panic. She would walk outside, select a mature plantain leaf, crush it, or chew it briefly to break the cell walls and release the active compounds, and apply it directly to the wound as a poultice, held in place with a clean cloth. What she was doing, without a chemistry degree or a laboratory, was delivering a concentrated local application of Aucubin Acteoside and Allantoin directly to infected tissue, simultaneously fighting the bacterial activity, reducing the inflammatory response, and beginning the cellular repair process. Documented accounts from Amish and Mennonite community health records describe this method being used with consistent success for infected cuts, insect stings, bee venom reactions, minor burns, and even the early stages of skin infections that, left untreated, could progress to serious systemic illness. The second major area of benefit that historical communities relied on, and that modern research has begun to seriously investigate, involves the respiratory system. The mucilage compounds in this plant create a physical coating effect on irritated mucous membranes, which is why preparations made from the dried or fresh leaves have been used for centuries to address persistent coughs, bronchial irritation, and the kind of deep chest congestion that used to keep farming families bedridden through the worst weeks of winter. There is published clinical research from European institutions, particularly from Germany and Poland, where herbal medicine has maintained a higher degree of scientific credibility than it has in the United States, documenting measurable reduction in cough frequency and throat irritation in patients given standardized plantain-based preparations compared to placebo groups. The third benefit that the Amish specifically valued and that connects directly to their philosophy of whole-body resilience rather than symptom suppression, was the plant's effect on the digestive system. The same mucilaginous compounds that coat and protect the respiratory tract perform a nearly identical function in the gastrointestinal lining. Communities that relied on preserved foods, salted meats, and seasonal diets that could be harsh on the stomach used plantain preparations regularly to address ulcerative discomfort, intestinal inflammation, and the kind of persistent digestive irritation that modern medicine typically addresses with acid-blocking pharmaceuticals. What the elders understood intuitively, and what gastroenterological researchers have begun confirming, is that a healthy mucosal lining is the foundational defense layer of the digestive system, and that plantain's mucilage compounds actively support and restore that lining rather than simply masking the symptoms of its deterioration. If what you have heard so far has genuinely surprised you, if you are sitting there thinking about how many times you pulled this plant out of your garden without knowing what you were throwing away, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, it helps this knowledge reach more people who need it, and it tells me that this kind of deep, recovered history is exactly what you want more of. Now, let us talk about the part of this story that the mainstream health establishment would very much prefer you never think too carefully about, because the disappearance of plantain knowledge from hospitals, medical schools, and public health education did not happen by accident. It did not happen because researchers studied this plant thoroughly and found it wanting. It happened because of a deliberate and well-documented process of institutional consolidation that reshaped the entire landscape of American medicine in the early 20th century, and whose consequences we are still living with today. In 1910, a report commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and authored by Abraham Flexner fundamentally restructured which forms of medical knowledge would receive funding, institutional legitimacy, and legal recognition in the United States. The Flexner Report, as it came to be known, was not simply an academic exercise in quality control. It was the mechanism by which botanical medicine, herbal practice, homeopathy, and every healing tradition that did not center on patentable pharmaceutical compounds was systematically delegitimized, defunded, and driven out of formal medical education. Medical schools that taught herbal therapeutics lost their accreditation. Practitioners who relied on plant-based preparations lost their licenses, and an entire generation of healers who had carried forward centuries of empirical community-tested botanical knowledge found themselves legally barred from practicing what their teachers had passed to them. The financial architecture behind this transformation was not subtle. John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil empire had developed significant financial interests in the petrochemical precursors used in synthetic drug manufacturing, was among the primary funders of the institutions that implemented the Flexner reforms. The economic logic was straightforward and ruthless. A plant that grows freely in every lawn and along every roadside cannot be patented. It cannot be manufactured in a controlled facility, bottled under a proprietary label, and sold at a markup that generates reliable quarterly returns for shareholders. Plantago Major, available to anyone willing to walk outside and learn to recognize it, represented exactly the kind of decentralized, unmonetizable healing resource that a pharmaceutical economy had every structural incentive to ensure the public forgot about entirely. And so it was removed from the curriculum. It was reclassified in the public imagination from medicine to weed. The word itself, weed, was doing enormous ideological work, training generations of homeowners to see the presence of this plant not as abundance, but as disorder, not as resource, but as problem, not as medicine, but as something to be sprayed, bagged, and discarded before the neighbors noticed. The Amish, because they made a conscious and principled decision to remain outside the cultural and economic systems that drove this erasure, never received that particular piece of miseducation. They kept pulling the leaf, they kept making the preparation, and they kept getting results that the official system insisted were impossible from something that grew between the cracks of a sidewalk. Here is what the elders actually did, and what you can do today with nothing more than a clean hand. A few minutes, and the plant that is almost certainly growing within 30 feet of where you are standing right now. The first step is harvest, and it matters more than most people realize. You want to collect plantain leaves in the morning, after any dew has dried, but before the heat of midday sun has begun to draw the plant's moisture and volatile compounds toward the soil. Select leaves that are fully mature, but not yellowing, deep green, firm to the touch. with those unmistakable parallel veins running clearly from stem to tip. Avoid any leaves growing directly beside a road with heavy traffic, near a lawn that has been chemically treated, or in soil you have any reason to believe has been exposed to herbicides or pesticides within the past several years. Rinse your harvested leaves gently under cold running water and pat them completely dry with a clean cloth, because excess moisture is the enemy of both a good poultice and a good dried preparation. For immediate wound care or an insect sting, the fresh poultice method is what the Amish reached for first. Take 2 or 3 mature leaves and either crush them firmly between your clean palms, bruising the tissue thoroughly until you see the green juice beginning to release, or chew them briefly if you are in the field and have no other option, which is exactly what Amish farmers did when an accident happened far from the house. Apply the crushed, juiced leaf mass directly to the affected area, pressing it gently against the skin, and hold it in place with a strip of clean cloth. Change the poultice every 2 to 3 hours, using fresh leaves each time, and continue for as long as redness, swelling, or irritation persists. For a longer-lasting preparation that you can store and use through the winter months, the traditional dried leaf infusion is what the elders prepared in quantity during the peak of summer harvest. Spread your cleaned leaves in a single layer on a dry cloth or a wire rack in a warm, well-ventilated space away from direct sunlight, and allow them to dry completely over the course of 5 to 7 days until they crumble cleanly. Between your fingers, with a sound like dry paper, store them in a sealed glass jar, away from heat and light, where they will hold their potency for up to 12 months. To prepare a medicinal infusion, take 1 heaping tablespoon of the dried crumbled leaf for every 8 ounces of water that you have brought to a full boil and then allowed to cool for exactly 2 minutes, because boiling water destroys a portion of the delicate mucilage compounds you specifically want to preserve. Pour the hot water over the dried leaf, cover the vessel immediately to trap the volatile compounds in the steam, and allow it to steep for a full 15 minutes before straining. The resulting liquid will be a pale golden green with a mild, slightly grassy taste that is not unpleasant, and it can be taken in quantities of 4 to 6 ounces, up to 3 times daily for respiratory irritation, digestive discomfort, or as a general antimicrobial support during the early stages of an illness. For topical use on skin infections, the same infusion can be cooled completely and applied directly to the affected area using a clean cloth as a compress, held in place for 20 minutes at a time. This is the preparation that Amish women kept ready through the winter. This is the formula that traveled across an ocean in the memory of healers who had no room in their luggage for anything that did not earn its place. And this is the knowledge that an entire institutional system spent the better part of a century trying to convince you was nothing more than folklore. Think about what that word actually means. Folklore is what powerful systems call the knowledge of ordinary people when that knowledge threatens to make those systems unnecessary. The Amish never needed a prescription to handle a wound that was turning. They never needed an urgent care visit for a chest that would not clear. They never needed a pharmacist to manage the kind of everyday physical challenges that for most of human history, communities handled themselves with confidence, with skill, and with the plants that grew freely around them. That confidence, that self-sufficiency, that refusal to be made dependent on a system that profits from your helplessness, is precisely what this channel exists to help you rebuild. Not in a reckless way. Not by abandoning medical care when medical care is genuinely what a situation requires, but by recovering the layer of knowledge that should have always been yours, the layer that was quietly removed from your education without your knowledge or your consent, and that has been waiting patiently in the cracks of your driveway ever since. Now, I want to hear from you directly, because your experience matters to this community. Leave me a comment right now answering this question. Have you ever used a wild plant or a home remedy that worked better than anything a doctor gave you? And if so, what was it, and what did it heal? Drop your answer below, because the knowledge in this comment section belongs to all of us. And the most powerful archive of ancestral wisdom this channel will ever build is the one you help write together, one comment at a time.